Welcome to the How I Met Your Mother podcast for the episode entitled Architect of Destruction. This is the 5th episode of the 6th season and the 117th episode of the series. With us today is Stephen Lloyd, executive producer and writer, and Robia Rashid, co-producer and writer. This is Alec Lev. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
So this week we are talking about an episode that you two didn't write.
That's correct.
Correct.
What did you do?
On any episode, the staff contributes to the rewriting process of an episode. So we weighed in on contributing jokes or cut ideas. And in this particular episode, Robbie and I were on the set for the entire shoot. Basically, if a line doesn't work, pitching an extra joke here or there, trying sort of alternative lines, just so that there are a few more options in the editing room.
Yeah, theoretically, we were, fixing anything that didn't work on set. Didn't really happen that often.
No.
It was a pretty smooth shoot.
No,
so.
in many ways, we made the episode a lot worse,
yeah,
probably, than it would.
We probably did.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. But let's talk about that process, because that's probably not something that people quite know about. So I think people have a easier time picturing a film. There's a writer and there's a director.
Right.
And when you're on the set, most likely the writer is not there giving notes to the actors,
right,
rewriting as it goes,
right,
depending on the size of your production. Here we are in television where you have showrunners,
right,
you have writers, you have a director. How does all that work on set?
Well, that's kind of what's cool about TV, is as a writer you have a little bit more to do with the production of an episode. But the director is sort of doing the bulk of the work on set, and we're just there in case a line isn't working. Or
So you'll film multiple options for lines?
Sometimes. I mean, basically, usually usually by the time you're shooting a script, it's gone through several revisions already, so you're pretty happy with the way it is. But often you just get down to the set and you say, that joke never really quite worked, let's try a different line there. Or you're there often just because you say, I think that joke would actually work better if you hit this particular word, or maybe give it this particular adjustment, or things like that. Basically, we're just there to try to sort of help with the comedy. And as Robbie is saying, that's a nice thing for a writer in television that you don't encounter in features, where often as a writer you're never even invited to set. In television, we're both writer-producers. We're able to be on set, and we have a very warm, inviting, wonderful director, Pam Fryman, who's eager to say, tell me what's, if you think the line should be delivered slightly differently for to make the joke work better, and the actors are very receptive to trying different lines or different jokes, just so you have those options in the editing room.
And sometimes you get there and a joke has presented itself in the way something's staged that you didn't notice before. There was a joke, we were doing an outside scene in this episode where the scene where Zoe has a van full of bunnies, and we realized in shooting it, wow, she got a really good parking spot. It's right in front of the house. So we pitched a joke about how good her parking spot was, which we wouldn't have thought of in the room because it wasn't visually in front of us.
That's very true. Yeah, with the script right in front of you, you don't necessarily know exactly what the environment is that you're going to be, making, jokes about until you get there.
Right. Well, let's talk about Zoe. So this is the first episode where we are introduced to Zoe, and this is I think we're allowed to say this is a fairly big story that we're starting here. Yes.
Yes.
Certainly. Yeah.
And unlike many of Ted's women before, this one puts up a pretty strong fight that so far we haven't seen the end of. This is not a relationship that isn't working out quite well. It's having trouble even starting.
Yeah.
Correct.
It's pretty adversarial almost from the beginning, which is kind of cool. And she's kind of a cool character in that way.
And was that a choice? Was that a let's give him someone to fight with because we haven't done that too much?
I think so. It's I think often a battle once you end up in the 6th year of a show where you've got a romantic lead who's bemoaning, why can't I find the one, and you've matched that person already with several different episodes, several different characters, who he hasn't worked out with, obviously, for various reasons, romantically. So finding an arc that's slightly different is always a bit of a challenge. But we landed on something that we sort of like with Zoe. Because she has a bunch of things in common with Ted. Obviously, their love of architecture and various other things. But obviously, they're at loggerheads over a fairly important professional opportunity for Ted.
And the idea of someone having a nemesis is kind of fun. Like, it's active and it's also really personal. And giving him a nemesis this season seemed like a fun thing, especially if it's a very cute girl like Jennifer Morrison.
And a lot of times it's often been on her the Robin wasn't ready for a relationship, right, or someone had a child, or this one. This is more just we're against each other.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
And yet
there are sparks.
There are sparks. One thing we've been talking about in the podcast is what Craig had said in the first podcast, that you try to have a through line to every episode, an essential kernel that goes through each of the stories. What would you say it was this week?
Let's see. Oh, yeah.
We'll just edit out the pauses, by the way.
Good.
I don't watch the show, so you're going to have to help me there.
There did seem to be a lot of talk about
which one's Ted.
Okay. He's the medium size.
Okay,
right. Dark hair.
New versus old.
Yes.
And what's important seemed to be what jumped out at me, not being a writer, a rewriter, or on set with the actors. But that's what I noticed.
Can you edit out the sarcasm?
No.
Yeah, new versus old is not only a theme in the episode, but I think it's a theme we want to play with throughout the season. And so that was a big part of even coming up with the idea of the story. I think that was a lot of that. Also, I think what's interesting about this episode and this season is it's a little bit, their stories this year are a little more grown up in a way. Like Marshall and Lily are trying to have kids, and Ted he's kind of at loggerheads with Zoe because he's making this career choice that's a little more mature and a little more. So I feel like that thematic element runs through a lot of episodes.
Now you did wade into the world of the men's locker room in this episode. I'm wondering where that storyline came from and what it was like to Robia. Was that
Steven?
The area of the men's locker room, specifically like how men don't really make eye contact in the locker room?
Well, actually, the whole story came from a couple different people on staff's experience with, once you hear about someone not being well endowed, it's kind of all you can think about. Once that kind of thing got mentioned in the story room, certain things like the men's locker rooms would spring out of it pretty quickly. And, as a girl, I just assumed the guys were talking all kinds of trash in the locker room. And turns out they're not. My husband's always really freaked out when he goes into a spa or something, and that he just there's always just one big fat guy kind of letting it all hang out.
Yeah, we did like that. We often like to play or try to play with that sort of the juxtaposition of basic understanding of how things are versus how they actually are. And the men's locker room, the idea that there are a bunch of guys just sort of bragging about their sexual conquest. Every guy in there said, "No, are you kidding? It's a bunch of guys excruciatingly uncomfortable because they're showering around total strangers and they just want to get out of there as possible." There's no eye contact, let alone conversation inside a locker room.
You brought up that you're a girl. True. Something else that people probably imagine television to be a pretty male-dominated world, and it certainly is, but not necessarily around this show. Right. I don't know if people realize that our director, executive producer, unit production manager,
line producer,
several writers,
editor.
These are all women. And is that unique in television?
It's not that common. I mean, I think I've definitely been on staff, so I think you see that there tend to be sort of more men than women. And on this staff, there are definitely more more women at all levels of production. Yeah, so which is nice.
What does that do to the dynamic of the story, of the work?
I think it's pretty helpful in coming up with stories. Like that you brought up, the locker room thing. The girls in the room really did think locker room talk was a thing. Guys talked about sex and all kinds of raunchy in the locker room, and it was a nice, and that directly translated into the episode. Lily says, "What about locker room talk?" I think it's helpful to have those perspectives in the room.
So how much do you two know about the future of the show? Not in terms of it being on the air, but the story. And tell us. No.
Well, we think we know some stuff, but we don't know if we know some stuff.
Yeah, I mean, if it's about who the actual mother is, we can't actually, obviously, weigh in on that. In terms of where the story.
Partly because we don't really know.
Partly because we don't really know, and I just want to seem like a big man and pretend. But in terms of actually sort of the stories that we're arcing, I mean, we usually, as a staff, we have a fairly sketched out idea, based on Carter of Craig of where this season is going, and then to various levels of detail, we probably know within the next sort of six episodes or so where things are going, and then next season and beyond is entirely up for grabs.
That
was barely English. I apologize.
We have a good sense of what this season is going to be, and partly that's because they want us all to be thinking about potential stories all the time, and it's easier to do when you know where you're heading.
And so let me just ask you two about yourselves and what you did in the business before this show. Steven?
I've been a writer for a while. I guess I've worked in sitcoms now for about 10 or 12 years. Before that, I was briefly a screenwriter for Warner Brothers for a couple years, working on a couple different animated projects. And before that, I was a student. So that's the extent of my career.
This is my 6th year as a TV writer. My first job was on Will and Grace in the last season, and then I worked on a show called The Loop, which was a short-lived show on Fox, which was very fun, and a show on the CW called Aliens in America.
Excellent show.
And then I was unemployed for 7 months, got married, and on my wedding day got this job. And this is my 3rd year on the show.
And that'll do it for this week. Thanks so much to our guests. Remember to watch How I Met Your Mother Monday nights on CBS, and now in syndication every night. Check your local listings. We're on Facebook at How I Met Your Mother and the Robin Sparkles fan page, and follow us all over Twitter at HIMYM_CBS, HIMYM_PROD, HIMYM_Writers, and Broslife, BROSLIFE. I'm Alec Lev, and thanks again for listening.